Hello, and welcome to Minding the Forest, a podcast of the Louisiana Forestry Association. I'm your host, Jeff Zeringue. In Minding the Forest, we'll talk about sustainable forestry, how important forests are to Louisiana and its economy, as well as issues in the forest products industry and how forests benefit everyone. We have with us Troy Mallach, who is the state wildlife biologist for Louisiana, which is the NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service. Is that correct?
That's correct. We're an agency of the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Okay. How long have you been with NRCS?
So, Jeff, I started with NRCS about 20 years ago. I started working on coastal restoration projects down in the coastal zone of Louisiana. Did that for about 15 years and moved up to Alexandria, took over the state wildlife biologist position about 5 years ago.
So have you webbed feet from down south?
Sure do.
Good. So tell me, Troy, a little bit about what do you do as the state wildlife biologist?
NRCS has 44 offices across the state that service each of the 64 parishes. So a landowner that's interested in doing wildlife conservation or even soil and water conservation can go to any of those offices that service his parish and meet with a district conservationist over there and do conservation. So as a state biologist, we actually have a couple of area biologists. One, Max Cox, he works in the northern part of the state, services the northern parishes. And we have Josh Swallow in the southern part of the state that services those parishes. We also have partnerships with several of the other agencies. We have David Bright up here in our office that works for Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. He kind of serves as a liaison between NRCS and Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. He's a super biologist, work with him quite a bit. Also have C.C. Richmond down in Leesville that does a lot of our longleaf pine restoration, our initiative that's down there. We also have partnerships with Quail Forever. We've got a couple of biologists that work for them. One's in our Minden office, Sabrina Clays, that does some restoration for quail habitat. Austin Klein's in our Bastrop office. He does some work over there. We partnership with the National Wild Turkey Federation. We have a biologist that works in our Leesville office. She's brand new. I hadn't met her yet, but I look forward to meeting with her. But so there's just, a huge part of this state that we have partnerships, and I work with them, collaborating on different projects and things like that to promote wildlife habitat.
Here at the Louisiana Forestry Association, we promote sustainable forestry. We promote managed forests, and I guess what's interesting is wildlife is pretty popular when it comes to landowners considering how they want to manage their property. I think people oftentimes think, I want timber and this and that, but they have a love for the land, and wildlife is very important to them. So how do you approach landowners who say, I have this forest land, I really love it, and I know I want it to be productive, and I want to make sure it has the best possibility for wildlife to be on it. What do you do?
No, that's a great question, and one that we work with landowners quite a bit about. But you probably know this better than I do, but, about half of the state is covered in forest land. So it's around 14 million acres in the state of Louisiana. 62% of that is privately owned. So there's a lot of landowners, some big, some small, but yeah, their interest a lot of times is in wildlife, and even obviously timber production is a big part of it. But wildlife is becoming more and more valuable, economically and, just for people in their terms of satisfaction in their property. So they are managing for wildlife. And I guess, our biggest thing is we kind of look at, and I think we have some programs I was going to discuss with you today.
Sure.
Quite a bit that are focused on, kind of this upland pine habitat. Historically, there was a couple of things that were going on, kind of drivers, I guess, that really these habitats evolved from, these wildlife habitats. And one of them obviously is fire. So these areas were burned quite a bit, usually by lightning strike, fire events. But every 2-3 years, 4 years that these areas were burned. The other thing is there was a lot of grazers, a lot of grazing animals that came through these areas. So if you can imagine kind of the Florida parishes, these longleaf pine areas across the central part of the state, where we are in Alexandria, longleaf pine areas, and then even up north in the shortleaf pine areas, kind of in the northwestern part of the parishes, we had really these huge pine savannas. And they were maintained, like I said, with fire, but there was a pine overstory with a herbaceous understory, grassy understory, and they were grazed by a lot of times buffalo. And so people don't think a lot about, buffalo in Louisiana.
No, they really don't. They think that of along the plains and things of that nature.
Sure, right. But we had these big, pine savannas, and the buffalo would come through, and they would call what we call flash grazing. They would come through those areas, and they would graze them, and between hoof action and fertilization from waste and just even enzymes in their saliva from grazing these plants, they really helped to promote these grassy understory and to kind of shade out these hardwood midstories. So that's kind of what we have evolved from, and what we've seen now is, I guess a couple hundred years ago, we eliminated the buffaloes and these big, large grazers. And then even over the past, 50 years, 60 years, we kind of got away from burning these areas. So what we've seen is that these areas have come up, instead of having that herbaceous understory, we've seen a brushy hardwood midstory, might be yopon or sweet gum, privet, where this midstory comes up and it really chokes out any of the sunlight or any of the herbaceous grasses that are on the underground. So we've seen a lot of loss of habitat in that fashion. So when we talk about wildlife, we had, bobwhite quail that use these areas. We had white-tailed deer. We had wild turkey, and so these aren't that type of habitat's not great for them. We also, have seen some of the other birds and even pollinators that we've lost habitat in those areas. So that's kind of what we look at when we go out to these areas. We try to restore these functions back to create the habitat.
So NRCS, through these programs, actually help with land management?
The district conservation will meet with them. They'll go over what we call resource concerns, like, what are the problems, basically, that you see out here. And one of them is inadequate habitat for wildlife. That may be one of the resource concerns that the landowners sees. And so they develop we have a 9-step planning process that they go through with the landowner, and they develop a unique conservation plan. This is what we're going to do to try to get your habitat back to where you want it, or where we can provide better habitat for whatever wildlife species. So when they're finished, like I said, they have a unique habitat plan that they can implement on their property. So that's basically what NRCS does. And there is some cost share available to some of these practices. Usually it'll take more than just one practice. I mean, there's several practices. We'll have forest management practices. We have brush management, herbaceous weed control, things like that. But it'll take several different applications, different practices to really get it where we need to have it.
So patience truly is a virtue in considering land management, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. No, it's not something that normally you can get to overnight, but it's a slow and steady that we can get it back to where it needs to be.
What's the most common question you guys get?
It's also pretty unique. I don't know if there's any. That's the kind of part that I find interesting, is that each piece of property has different problems or different resource concerns. So obviously, like you said earlier, landowners are concerned with wildlife, but it may be a different species that they're concerned with. For the most part, landowners are concerned about game species. They want to have more quail, they want to have more turkeys, they want to have more white-tailed deer. And look, I agree 100% with them. But each of those species really depend on that same habitat. It's not just managing for one thing. We're managing for the health of the habitat. And so I think that's probably the maybe a misconception. Probably the most common misconception I see is we have and we can talk about it in a little bit. We have some working lands for wildlife projects that I wanted to talk about. One of them is out in Washington Parish. It was probably our original working lands for wildlife project, but it's a gopher tortoise working lands for wildlife project. What's really kind of interesting about that is the gopher tortoise was listed as a threatened species in Louisiana. Now, it occurs in Mississippi, Alabama, Florida as well, but it's a candidate species that hadn't been listed. And so what NRCS did was we worked with Fish and Wildlife Service, and we said, look, we have some landowners that are interested in doing habitat management. We think will help the gopher tortoises. But they're concerned, and like any landowner that has maybe an endangered species on their property, they're concerned about doing management that may not fit with Endangered Species Act, that may cause a take of the species. So what that project did was we said, look, we know what we need to do to get this habitat. We need to do some thinnings. We need to push some fire breaks. We need to burn it, do some prescribed burning, things like that, try to get that herbaceous understory back into the area. But occasionally, we may run over a gopher tortoise. So the Working Lands for Wildlife project actually provides assurances to landowners that, we've worked with the service, and we've got, we've taken away any liability that you may have if a tortoise is injured while you're doing the management, because ultimately the management is what the tortoises need. If one of them gets, burned, that's not good, but at the same time, the rest of them are going to have better habitat, and that's what they need. So I think it's a little different, like I said, wherever you go, but we had that. We started it in the Florida parishes, Washington, one of them. And it's a little unique over there because the landowners over there, they really like having endangered species on their property. They really? Think it's great. They like the gopher tortoise, and the gopher tortoise is a neat animal. I mean, they're a big tortoise that burrows underground, and they're what we call a keystone species. They provide habitat for a lot of other different species, and so they're neat. They're long lived, so they can kind of follow them, have them around, and things like that. So they like it, and so. We're doing management for gopher tortoises. We're providing them assurances, that if something happens to an individual tortoise, that they're covered.
Is that only through the NRCS program? So if I had property that I wanted to manage for wildlife and I was doing some of the normal forestry practices that are good for the tortoise, yet there's a take, but I'm not in the NRCS program, would I still be liable? Is that something that can actually protect you?
Sure.
Even though you're doing the same practices.
So if you were going to do some practices on a area that has occupied by gopher tortoises, the Endangered Species Act requires that you consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service before you do it. Mm-hmm. So you would, as a private individual would have to consult with them and say, hey, this is what I'm doing. And so if you didn't do that, or if during your consultation, you didn't follow what they call conservation measures, where they say, hey, you can't go any closer than 13 feet from a burrow. If you're doing some mowing or you're doing some fire breaks, if there's a burrow there, you got to make sure your fire break stays. But if you didn't do those things, or if you didn't consult, you'd certainly be liable. So that's kind of what we did up front with this program, is we said, look, we've already, consulted with the service. Mm-hmm. We'll add these measures to your plan. So your plan, that conservation plan we talked about, is going to include, okay, when you do a fire break, you can't get closer than 13 feet from a burrow. If you do some thinning, you can't pile slash on top of a burrow. Just things like that what they call conservation measures that we worked with the service to make sure that, hey, we're going to do these, we're going to include them in our plan, and that way the landowner's protected. So it's just kind of taken, I guess, that step up front, so a landowner, doesn't have to do that, isn't required to do that on their own. But they certainly can, and some do. So. But
you also get a chance, I think you had mentioned earlier, that there's a cost share available if they participate in these programs. And that seems to be a big deal.
Sure.
Because it can be quite expensive to manage property and to manage it well.
Absolutely.
So if they are managing it well and they understand that they're going to spend considerable amount of money to do that, they can actually get a cost share, which is a reimbursement.
That's correct. So different practices have different amount of cost share, and I think a lot of them, will even cost share up to 90% of the cost, reimburse them. So right, when they do like a prescribed fire, once it's completed, our district conservation will go back out to the property. They'll look at it and say, yeah, you completed the practices, and then we'll reimburse them up to 90%, I think is the max for that practice.
So the reimbursement varies on what the practice is, or how does that work?
On what the practice is. Okay. We'll have some what we call priority practices that will include a 90% cost share, but some of the other ones may not be as high, but certainly, what we call priority in these areas is fire breaks, prescribed burning, and things like that we really need to have on the landscape for wildlife. So.
And to consider this, if you're starting a program for Working Lands for Wildlife, then it's not a 1-year deal. This is something that you would do in stages. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. Normally, like I said, they'll build a conservation plan, and so some of these areas they have this hardwood midstory that's grown up for maybe the last 50 years. And the fire load is so high, you can't burn that, without burning everything. So maybe the first thing they need to do is a forest stand improvement, where they'll go out and do a thinning on that property. And then they'll have to do maybe a brush management, where they start to do some practices to control that hardwood midstory until you can get it into shape where you can actually start to do some prescribed burning and things like that. So a lot of, again, each individual place is unique, so but normally it's not a quick one shot deal where you have multiple steps of projects and practices that you have to implement.
Does the Working Lands for Wildlife, is it always concerned with endangered species or threatened species, or is it for anything else?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked me that, because originally that's what it started out with, just really a candidate species or a species that's on the list. So, and let me, I guess, back up just a little bit further. What we found, and this was even when I was working for the Fish and Wildlife Service in 2000, we found that landowners are mostly interested in managing their property for game species. And so what happened is, you had some of these areas, and maybe, they've grown up in this hardwood midstory, and they saw a decline in maybe bobwhite quail or wild turkeys or deer, all of them. But also what happened is we saw a decline in red cockaded woodpeckers. So these birds that live in a, pine forest with a herbaceous understory were listed. And I think this was probably 70s or 80s, one of the first ones that were listed from this ecosystem. And so landowners that were doing things for wildlife, for game species, actually found that it encouraged these RCWs, red cockaded woodpeckers, to use their property, which, they didn't have any concern with them, but when you have a listed species, you may have some regulations, and the regulations are often kind of complicated. I have some of them here that I could go through, but with RCWs, if you have an RCW cluster, you have to provide up to 70 or a minimum of 75 acres of foraging habitat for that species. You have to provide that on, at least 10-inch pine basal, or with the basal area of I think between 40 and 70 square foot of, a basal area per acre. So it's a fairly thin open forest that, landowners are managing for. And then when they get this woodpecker, then they got more regulations, and they're can be complicated. So what happened is we saw landowners that, maybe said, look, I'd like to manage this for wildlife, for wild turkeys, but I really don't want any more of these RCWs, because then I have to do some more management. I got more regulations, and I may not understand them all completely. Mm-hmm. So we understood that, and this is when I was working at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Working with them, we understood that this was a problem. We were seeing this on other properties. And so we worked with the Louisiana Department of Wildlife Fisheries as a Fish and Wildlife Service employee to put together what's called a safe harbor agreement. Eric Baca with LDWF is still, I worked with him basically writing the program, but what it did was provide assurances to landowners that said, look, if you want to manage this for game species, and you get red cockaded woodpeckers, we're not going to increase your regulations. We're going to allow you to manage it, and we're going to allow, we're going to actually hope that more RCWs show up. And if for whatever reason you need to get rid of them, or if you want to do some harvest and things like that, we'll come get them and we'll move them somewhere, because we've got plenty of places to put them. And so working with Eric Baca, like I said, with LDWF, we put together a safe harbor agreement for landowners. And that's kind of, I think, one of the best partnerships that we have in Louisiana. I know there's quite a bit of enrollment in that program. Still, I think it's a 99-year agreement. I know it's a 99-year agreement that we put together. So it's in place for several more years. And landowners are enrolling. They're able to do the management. Because I think one of the biggest misconceptions is if they're in RCW safe harbor, they may be interested. I don't really want to manage for red cockaded woodpeckers. I want to manage for turkeys. Well, guess what? It's the same. So you can get in a safe harbor agreement and you can have some assurances that you're not going to increase regulations, but you can do the management that you wanted to do for other species. So
it kind of sounds like I guess maybe the understanding of some landowners might be, if I get red cockaded woodpeckers on my property, then I can't do anything. And that, from what you're saying, doesn't sound necessarily true.
That's exactly what the safe harbor agreement was put in place to do, is to say, look, we want to encourage you to manage your property. We want you to, do prescribed fire. We want you to get rid of that hardwood mid-story that's choking out this herbaceous layer. Yes, you can enroll in that program. You can do the management. And we have seen, what they call the baseline number. When you enroll, you have one cluster, 2 clusters, whatever it is your baseline. And so if your baseline increases, you're not required to manage, over that baseline. And you actually can have, like I said, actually move anything above baseline. You can actually move to some other forest or things like that.
Let's talk a little bit about the regulations you mentioned earlier that seem to be, at least from an outsider looking in, maybe a bit confusing and, quite frankly, could be scary, because we have this idea that if it's an endangered species, then we are restricted in so many ways that we can't do anything or can't do what we want to do.
So it's a consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service. Mm-hmm. And so what the Fish and Wildlife Service will do is they'll have what they call conservation measures. And so what we were able to negotiate with them is, what does a landowner need to avoid and what can he do with this endangered species? So, like a red cockaded woodpecker, they have a cavity they build in a live pine tree. Well, certainly you can't damage that cavity tree, because it takes a long time for that woodpecker to be able to excavate that cavity. And so, that's protected. And I think, as long as you're able to, let the landowners understand exactly what it is they can do and what they can't do, it gets rid of that confusion. You have to make sure you protect those cavity trees. You can't put a fire break right through the middle of a cluster. Things that that are what we call conservation measures, but easy
seems
enough,
more like common sense not to do that.
Easy enough for landowners to understand, mm-hmm. and so. That goes into a plan maybe that that a landowner, if they're working with NRCS, would put together. We'd outline those conservation measures, and certainly if they're working with LDWF with Eric and the Safe Harbor Agreement, that would be some of the things what they would call a baseline, and these are what you can and can't do and things like that. So,
what are some of the regulations that are maybe not necessarily common sense or wouldn't seem commonsensical, but could be quite a challenge for landowners?
Yeah, and look, I have them printed out because, they can be pretty tough to understand, and so I need to dig for them and find them. But that's kind of the so yeah. Here's the guidelines for RCWs, and it's probably 20 pages long. Of course, can't remove any cavity tree, can't damage a cavity tree. Here's constructing roads or right of ways within the cluster. Foraging habitat is probably some of the stuff that's the most, I guess, confusing or So we talked a little bit about it, but each cluster, landowners asked to provide a minimum of 75 acres of foraging habitat. That habitat has to be at least 30 years old in pine or even older than that. The pine basil area has to be between 40 and 70 square foot an acre, which is pretty thin, as far as stocking goes. Try to control the mid-story, hardwood mid-story, because, like these other species, when that hardwood mid-story comes up, the RCW, it's no longer good habitat for them. So they'll usually don't leave, but they'll stay, and they have trouble with reproducing and things like that, and so eventually they'll what they call we'll lose them basically.
Louisiana pine snake is one that has come pretty recently, and I think the regulations came up for that in the last 2 years maybe. That seems to be a challenge for some, because there was a big discussion on how deep do you plant? Do you machine plant? Do you hand plant?
Right.
And it would seem like in either case, there's the possibility that if you go deep enough, you could harm one of these snakes.
Right. So the neat thing, or the unique thing about a pine snake, is they spend up to 90% of their time underground. So they're in these gopher burrows with the pocket gopher burrows. They live in there. They feed on pocket gophers in these piney forests with sandy soils and herbaceous understory and things like that. So it's really similar. The habitat is similar for all three of them. When we talk about red cockaded woodpeckers or gopher tortoises over in the Florida parishes, this is kind of the gopher tortoise version in the Southwest. We have the Louisiana pine snake. The biggest difference with this is that the people in the Florida parishes, they love the gopher tortoise. Not a lot of people like snakes. And so the management's the same, and we've got people that are really interested in doing management for the game species and things that'll help the snake. But there's that misconception with, I don't want any snakes. I don't want to do any management for snakes and things like that. So it's been a struggle for NRCS and for landowners really to promote this program or project. Like you said, the snake was listed. I think in 2018 it was listed. But we started working on this even when it was a candidate species. We started working on this Working Lands for Wildlife project really to try to improve habitat for the pine snake in the western part of the state. We haven't had a lot of interest, I guess. The main thing is you can do the management that you want. If a snake gets burned, you're covered under this program. Now, there's some conservation measures that we talked a little bit about with the RCW or the gopher tortoise. Most of those kind of focus on these pocket gopher burrows because you don't really see a pine snake. They're underground. But you can, and it's not really easy, but you can kind of identify these pocket gopher mounds and things like that. So the conservation measures really kind of focus on these pocket gopher mounds.
So if you manage for the pocket gophers, you subsequently create an environment, or a habitat rather, that is favorable to the Louisiana pine snake.
That's correct. And so what we want to do is avoid, putting a fire break right through a pocket gopher mound, or pile and slash, if you're doing a thinning, pile and slash on top of a pocket gopher mounds. But we do still need those same forest stand improvement projects that we talked about, thinning, try to get that sunlight down to the ground so we can encourage that herbaceous understory, because that's really what the pocket gophers feed on, that herbaceous grasses, roots and things underground. They'll eat the roots, and then the snakes will eat the pocket gophers. So there's not a big need, because a lot of times, honestly, if a snake is harmed, you may not even know it. I mean, if you run over a snake that's 2 feet under in a burrow, you may not even know that it happened. So you don't see where a landowner says, yeah, I mean, unfortunately I burned one, or I ran. And look, when you run a prescribed fire through a forest, these pine snakes get into those burrows, they're fine. I mean, they're protected in there. So you don't see a lot of damage, or find a lot of snakes that are killed, but they are protected if it were to happen. But it's not, landowners don't see a big need for it. And so, I think it's great they're doing management, for the wildlife. And it is a potential to, if they want to do these conservation practices, which really they're not, that cumbersome, that really I think the hardest part is just really kind of identifying pocket gopher mounds, because certain times of year they're hard to find. So
one of the things too is landowners, they want to manage for wildlife, but they always want to manage for harvests as well. How do these programs have you look at a different angle when it comes to harvesting your timber?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because we don't cost share on timber harvest, but obviously we understand landowners are growing timber to be able to harvest and to make a profit. So when landowners do go in, which they need to, I mean, a lot of times they need a thinning, so we'll do forest stand improvement projects with them, and they can harvest some timber during that process. But when they're doing timber harvest and things like that, they need to follow our conservation measures, and basically if there is any take or things like that, they're covered.
They're covered even during a harvest. They're covered in the event that the unfortunate thing happens, that they run over a snake or they affect a gopher tortoise that happens to be above ground at the time.
Right, as long as they're following their conservation plan, which is what, we worked with them, put that plan together. As long as that's part of that plan, they're covered. So, but if they decide, look, I don't want to follow this plan anymore, I'm just going to cut everything down and whatever, if it's not part of the plan, there's probably some gray area in there that they might need to be careful for. But as long as they're following that plan, and look, that plan could include, cutting everything and replanting to maybe longleaf, which as long as it's part of that plan, look, they're covered. So that's the important thing, is that, when they meet with that district conservationist or soil conservationist, like I said, there's a 9-step process they go through, and there's a unique conservation plan that they get. And look, it may be, over the next 10 years, 15 years, this plan that they can follow. But as long as they're following that, yes, they're covered. And so that's it. I think one of the important things is that, I like to stress is that conservation plan is important.
So a landowner can inquire help from you guys, and then you would go out there and go through the 9-step program to reach that management. Can't do anything about helicopters. Dadgummit.
Yeah.
Okay, let's try that. So a landowner can come to you, go through the 9-step program, at the end of it decide, I'm not sure. So at any stage along that, they can always say, no, I think that's too much, I don't want to do it.
Oh, absolutely, sure.
But they still run the risk that if they're practicing in a management plan and they're not in the program, if a take happens, they could be liable.
That's exactly right. So it's a voluntary, plan that the landowners, can either agree to do or not to do. It's all, they're ultimately what we call the decision maker. They make the decisions. Mm-hmm. So if it's something that, they're not comfortable with and they don't want to do it, that's fine. Right. But the coverage as far as the take for the Endangered Species Act, is, required that they follow these conservation measures. So each species have what we call conservation measures that we negotiated with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and as long as they're following it, and those are in the plan, and the landowner follows those measures, then he's covered. But if he decides, I'm not going to follow these measures anymore, then at that point he's not covered from take, and he can certainly negotiate with the Fish and Wildlife Service on his own, do a consultation, what it's called, and provide, they'll provide his own measures to him, or maybe if he's going to do some take, there's certain things that they can work with, habitat conservation plan, things like that, where they can even provide take for some species in certain cases. But I worked on those when I was with the service too. That is a cumbersome process, but there's certainly, it's available for them to do.
So if many of these landowners that may not have a management plan, it would seem easy enough that they can go in and really ask any question, everything. But several do have consulting foresters who are helping them in their management plans. Do you find a lot of interaction with consulting foresters in Louisiana?
Yes, and so Rick Williams is our state forester, and he works with several of the, I think what they call CAP, and I'm terrible with acronyms, but it's basically where they build a plan, that a consulting forester can build a plan. Rick will review the plan with them, and so certainly, yeah, they can help us, much like our partner biologists help me with some of the conservation for wildlife.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what else have we not talked about this morning?
Let me look in my notes because. I guess we kind of started off talking about the functions, the drivers of these upland pine forests. One being prescribed fire, the other one is these large grazers and buffaloes and things coming through Louisiana, flash grazing. What's interesting is I think we've really started making some headway with the prescribed burn. And one of the other things that I wanted to talk about a little bit today was these large grazing animals. So we're starting to see some landowners that are starting to actually add back what we call a mimic, a biological mimic of these buffaloes, where they're using some woodland cattle. And I think you probably done some stories with David Daigle.
Yeah, David Daigle in Bogart Parish.
Exactly.
Interesting fellow. That seems to be a very big passion of his, to incorporate forestry and cattle, longleaf in particular. Seems very happy doing that.
Absolutely. And so he's kind of the one that introduced the idea to me, and that there's these two functions, one being that grazer that's really important. And so I think we've seen, what it's done on his place, and it'll extend, that rotation of fire. Instead of having to burn it every 2 or 3 years, if you're doing some grazing on it, and it's not just, grazing everything, but a prescribed grazing plan that our range conservationist works with David to put together. But if you're grazing it properly, that hardwood mid-story is controlled by the mechanical action of these cattle, some of the fertilizer from waste, even the enzymes from the saliva when they're feeding, promoting these grasses that'll outcompete some of this brush stuff. So you maybe instead of burning it every 2 or 3 years, you can burn it every 3 to 4 years. You get, a little bit extra. And the habitat is improved. So we're seeing that, and I say habitat improved, and I mean for like quail, for turkey, deer, things like that. We're seeing that David's place for sure. We're kind of starting to promote that in the northwest part of the state with some silvopasture projects where landowners are interested, like you said, instead of just having timber, they can incorporate grazing and improve their wildlife habitat. So that's kind of the second step that I'm really seeing starting to come on, recently. So it's exciting.
Troy Mallach, he's a state wildlife biologist for NRCS for Louisiana. Troy, thanks for joining us. Appreciated that.
Jeff, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it. I appreciate it. Look forward to coming back anytime.
Thank you for listening to Minding the Forest, a podcast of the Louisiana Forestry Association. If you'd like to learn more about sustainable forestry, the LFA and its programs, and how you can be part of an organization that supports landowners, loggers, and wood manufacturers in the state, go to laforestry.com. And remember, at the Louisiana Forestry Association, we're minding the forest for you.